Thank you very much, Linda, and thank you to all of you for what you're doing on climate and clean energy. We all agree and shouldn't have to fight the argument that climate change is real and clean energy and climate are critical to not only future generations, but also building our sustainable economy here in Massachusetts and across the United States. And Massachusetts has been a leader, continues to be a leader for sure. But what I want to talk about three things actually. Community solar is what Linda asked me to talk about, as well as the climate bill. But even the siting reform legislation that Linda referenced, I had the honor of serving as one of the commissioners on that siting commission that Governor Healy had convened back in September. So I can give you a little insight into that as well, maybe some of the
Great.
highlights and its relation to the climate bill. But I'll start with community solar. Maybe, and I had originally thought to do slides, but I said, you know what, I would much rather this be a conversation, and I can send you the resources that I reference, so you can take a look at them yourself. And in Massachusetts, we have a little over 5 gigawatts of solar that have been installed and are operating here as of Q1 2024. Just to give you a sense of where we were in 2010 and where we are today, we had about 5 megawatts of installed solar back then. And through very thoughtful policy that has been enacted during the Patrick administration, the Baker administration, and the Healy administration, we're now well over 5 gigawatts of solar. It makes up a little over 20% of our total generation mix in Massachusetts. And one of the real success stories in driving that, in addition to residential solar, the solar loan program that previously existed, it's really the incentive programs. So originally SREC 1 and SREC 2, and now SMART. And I mention all of that to you because community solar as a offering, as a initiative, really started with the SREC 2 program. Prior to that, our solar incentive program did not have a mechanism to create opportunities where residents, small businesses, low-income ratepayers could benefit from and participate in solar through a program like this. With SREC 2, they created community solar, which in essence is a solar developer builds a solar project. That solar project then generates credits. Those credits can then be sold to customers, residents, small businesses, at a discount, meaning you get, in turn, savings on your electricity bill, and you're enabling a solar project to be built in or around your community. And so that's really what community solar is all about. And as I mentioned to you, we have about a little over 5 gigawatts of solar that have been installed to date, maybe closer to 6. And well over a gigawatt of that represents community solar. So community solar has really helped to drive adoption for solar in Massachusetts. The incentive program that I mentioned in SREC 2 then was carried into the current SMART program. And a good number of projects in the company that I work for is focused on community solar projects, has been driven through the SMART program. When you develop a project, the state has incentivized those developers to build community solar projects through what's called an adder. So with the incentive program that exists, you get additional incentive if you build a community solar project, because it's the Commonwealth's goal to enable more and more people to participate in clean energy. And so that program and that initiative has enabled us to build more community solar in Massachusetts. We really have been a leader nationally on the community solar front. They've also, the Commonwealth, through the SMART program, has tried to incentivize more low-income community solar opportunities as well. providing real benefits to low-income customers, affordable housing units. And so that has been a real benefit from the program most recently. But the SMART program is currently under review, so which is a good thing, because there has been a drop in the number of community solar projects that have been developed in Massachusetts, because the incentive program under SMART is at a point where it's gone far enough down the line from a block perspective that it's not as economical right now to develop community solar projects. And so part of this review that the Commonwealth is doing, the Department of Energy Resources, is how to reinvigorate that effort. There's a straw proposal that was issued recently. And so the good news is that the Commonwealth, through their own analysis, working with the third party, has identified that, in fact, the incentives need to be adjusted to enable more development of community solar, low-income community solar. And so the straw proposal increases the base compensation rate for all solar projects. It also creates a new component, right? That new component is annually rates will be adjusted. The current program is what they call a declining block program. So they set a base rate. After 200 megawatts of solar are installed, that base rate is adjusted down. After 200 more megawatts, it's adjusted down. So we're really now at that point, because costs have gone up and there's been inflationary impact, tariff impacts, supply chain impacts. The hope was that we would get the cost of solar down so that it didn't need much of an incentive. And while prices have gone up, overall solar continues to go down, but it's not at a point now where without incentive it can't continue. And so they've decided, instead of doing this kind of blunt instrument every 200 megawatt, you step down the incentive, they're going to readjust it and look at it annually and change that rate annually based on a number of different factors, which is better for the ratepayer, it's more predictable for the developer, and it will enable more solar to be built in Massachusetts. One other interesting component is they've now blended the community solar and low-income community solar adder, at least that's what they're proposing. And with low-income community solar, the project owner has to guarantee that a low-income customer at least is realizing a 20% savings on their electric bill in order to qualify. For basic community solar, it's 10%, at least 10%. And for low income, it's 20%. So the good news is they're evaluating the SMART program again now. They recognize that they need to make adjustments. And this is all in the context of mandates that have been set for us to reach overall on our clean energy and climate goals, carbon emissions reductions, and installation of renewable energy generating units. The goal is by 2030 to realize close to 10 gigawatts of installed solar. So if we're at around 5 gigawatts now, we still have a long way to go in 6 short years. And so this this SMART review is intended to also eliminate barriers. It's looking at land use issues. It's looking at process issues. I can send you the link so you can take a look at the straw proposal that currently is on the table. Obviously, land use organizations are engaged, the development community is engaged, environmental justice communities are engaged in this discussion. And the hope is that they'll begin a regulatory process to implement these changes within the next few months. And the hope is that this program rollout will be much shorter, Phil can appreciate this, than the rollout of the SMART program in the first phase, which took much longer than it should have. It requires DPU approval. That can take a long time. So the hope is that they'll streamline it. So things are moving. The Commonwealth is working to make adjustments to ensure that there is more community solar that's developed. I will also mention that Bluewave, as a community solar developer, is now actually pairing community solar with agrivoltaic development, which is something we're really excited about. We're innovating on. The SMART program allows for agrivoltaics. There's an incentive to build agrivoltaics projects. For those of you who aren't familiar with agrivoltaics, that's where you build a solar project much higher than your standard ground-mounted solar project, with trackers which allow the panels to track with the sun, the movement of the sun. And underneath those panels, you either grow crops, different kinds of crops, or you do grazing of cattle or other livestock, or you do hay. And you design them in such a way that you can get agricultural equipment, tractors, and other agricultural equipment through and around those arrays. That's something that you can actually stack. You stack your agrivoltaics project with community solar, and the value and benefit is the farmer doesn't have to sell their land, and it end up being subdivided for housing. The farmer actually can continue to grow crops, keep their farm. You're generating savings for community solar customers, and you're generating clean power for the Commonwealth and tax revenue for the community. So SMART allows all kinds of different variations of community solar development. And so I'll stop there for now, see if there are any questions, particularly about community solar.
I have a couple of questions, Mark. When you were talking about the evaluation of the SMART program and the incentives, is that something the legislature does? What agency does that? Is that the clean energy?
The Department of Energy. Yeah, the Department of Energy Resources is the agency that oversees the SMART program. It was established legislatively, but the responsibility to create the rules and policies and procedures is DOER, in conjunction with the Department of Public Utilities. So there are really two agencies at the end of the day. Anytime you impose a rate on a utility or any form of an incentive on a utility, it requires approval by the Department of Public Utilities. So DOER and DPU work hand in hand to implement the program and make any adjustments to that program.
So that's not dependent on the legislative cycle, which ended on June. So that's a separate
Correct.
process.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, and DOER was thoughtful in how they approached this, because they did a technical potential of solar study. They looked at the entire Commonwealth, and they looked at all kinds of solar development where it conceivably could be developed. So whether it's rooftop, carports, resi, large ground mounted. They looked at the entire state. They looked at all of the overlays on zoning, land use restrictions, and they came up with a technical potential. Now, I will tell you, those of us that follow this, when we looked at the technical potential of solar study, it is imperfect. There were some layers that showed solar on roadways, so you have to discount some of that. However, it was helpful to understand where and how potentially we could realize the number of megawatts that we're going to need in order to meet our clean energy mandate. So that was a helpful data point. DOER also engaged a third-party consultant, a Sustainable Energy Advantage, who is expert in power economics, energy economics, solar, and they looked at the costs, right? So we in the development community were saying it's getting harder and harder from a cost perspective, but you need that kind of neutral third party to confirm whether or not that is in fact the case. So they hired a third party. So taking the technical potential, taking this economic analysis, that informed them on what the straw proposal would look like. There are definitely some land constraints that the development community is certainly concerned about, but this is a public process that will continue. Like I said, DOER is hoping to file their regulations on new SMART program or the updates to the SMART program within the next few months. And then that takes a certain period of time before it's enabled. So that's on the solar front. That's what's happening very specifically now, that is not at all related to the climate bill that was in this last formal session. So I'll stop there if you have any other questions.
Right. Does anyone else have questions about community solar before Mark moves on? It looks like Carol, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Could you say the word again about the elevated panels that allow agriculture underneath? I didn't catch it.
So you have standard heights for a ground mounted system. And that ground mounted system, you probably have some in your community or other communities. Imagine an array that is higher, close to, I think, 10 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet high off the ground, as opposed to 3 feet off the ground or 4 feet or whatever the case may be. So canopies for agriculture are just raised panels spread at a distance so that you can either get crops planted underneath them, or cattle grazing, or hay cultivation. And then you have what they call trackers. So the panels themselves, on a standard ground mounted system, those are fixed, tilted panels. They don't move. So the sun comes around and there's a certain period of time where, there's a lot of inefficiency because the sun is not directly on the panels. But with trackers, those trackers will actually go from this way to this way, in essence, following the sun. They're dual use, and there's dual access and single access trackers that, they go very slowly, but they follow or track with the position of the sun. So it's a little more efficient than if you just had a fixed tilted system. And so we design all of our agricultural, we call them agrivoltaics projects, or the vast majority of them, with trackers, because you get more efficiency, you get more generation, you get more power, because those panels are touching the sun for a longer period of time.
What I'm still not getting is, what is that called? Is it agro something?
Agrivoltaics.
Agrovoltaics.
Yes.
Thank you.
Agrivoltaics.
So Massachusetts has an established program for agrivoltaics under SMART. It means, so you get that base rate, then you get the agrivoltaics adder on top of it, which is an additional incentive. However, and the state's done it right, Massachusetts has done it correctly, you have to get a predetermination approved by the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources in conjunction with the UMass Clean Energy Extension Program. So you have to get approval based on what you claim yield will be. There's a shading tool that you have to utilize. So it's not like a developer says, you know what, I'm just going to do an agrivoltaics project and we'll hope for the best. There are strict guidelines that need to be followed. The state has to approve your agrivoltaics project. You have to have a farm plan. You have to have a farmer that farms that farm plan. You have to do, annual reporting, and you risk losing that adder if what you say you're going to yield in crop growth or crop production or cattle grazing, whatever the case may be, you could lose that adder if you're not consistently producing what you say you're going to produce. So there are some really good, strict requirements for doing agrivoltaics projects. And that's why there aren't a ton of developers that are doing them. We have 4 projects right now that we've completed. One is in Dighton, Massachusetts, so closer to all of us. We have 2 projects in Palmer, Massachusetts, a project in Haverhill, and we have an ongoing project in Douglas, Massachusetts, in our first portfolio of projects. Carol, you may hear the term dual use, or you may hear the term agrivoltaic. Dual use means it's more than one use. So it's not just generating power, there is another use to it. One of those uses is agrivoltaics, or agricultural production. So agrivoltaics is specifically focused on agriculture related activities.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Dan, please.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you ever lease large roofs.
So we don't, I mean, Phil, I don't know if you do commercial scale, ground mounted or residential scale.
Well, I've done some commercial and
I saw one years ago that was residential. It was a
Yep.
big apartment complex and they had rented their roof and I've never heard of one since and I wondered about that.
Bill?
That's called a site lease, in which the company will say, this is such a good roof, if you don't want to buy it, we'll put it up there, we'll buy it, we'll maintain it, and we'll reap the benefits from it. I'm
Oh,
not sure how common they are
yeah.
anymore, but I was pretty familiar with them because I did some commercial as well. It's a site lease.
I see.
So similar, it's not dissimilar to what in most cases a ground mounted system is, right? So even in that instance of an agrivoltaics project, the owner of that asset, the owner of that project leases that land for 20 years with typically 2 5-year extensions. And so, you know, the owner retains ownership of the underlying land.
Mhm.
And the developer or ultimately the owner operator will lease that land for, you know, at least 30 years.
Mm.
We're still probably what, 5 or 10 years out from those projects that hit their 30 years. You're still going to get a ton of energy out of solar projects even after 30 years. I go back to at Beverly High School, there was a project that was built in the Carter administration, and that solar project is still
Wow.
operating. The efficiency drops.
Mm.
I think it's 0.5% per year or something along those lines.
Mm.
But there's still, you know, an operating project that's now what, 50 years old at Beverly High School.
Wow.
But anyway, so some property owners own the system on their roof. It's just like residential. You know, we always recommend the best thing you could possibly do at the resi scale, if you can afford it, is to own the system, not do a PPA and lease the land.
Mhm.
But when you get
Yeah.
to commercial scale or land, you know, large ground mounted systems, the typical model is that the developer or owner operator of the system leases the property that's on.
Thank you.
Other
Sure.
questions on community solar?
Yes, Mark, I don't know if you know it. I think you may know it, that there are 81 homeowner associations in Massachusetts, and all of them restrict solar energy,
Yep.
including our Pine Hills. So is it because of community solar, anyone can use it,
Participate. Yep.
participate,
Yep.
okay?
Yeah, I'm an example of that. So for me, my house in Fairhaven, I could put solar panels on the front of my house, but I just don't want, and I'm a solar guy. I just don't want to put them on the front of my house.
Why not?
Well, I'm going to sell my house in 2 or 3 years, and you'd be surprised that you shrink the universe of interested buyers by having them on the front of your house. I'd put them on the back if that was the most efficient place to put them. But some people put them on the front. You now have the shingle technology that's available. So that being said, and some people can't put them on their roofs, the pitch of their roofs, shading, or they don't want to lease it and they can't afford to own it. So all of those things make community solar. So that's what I decided to do. There's a project down the street from me that actually my company developed at the time. We don't own it anymore, but I'm a community solar customer. So I get at least 10% savings on my electric bill annually as a result of that project. So I get to participate and I helped enable a 1 megawatt solar project in my town. That's generating tax revenue for the town.
So I have one more question on community solar before we move on, and that is, what if there's somebody who lives in Plymouth and they say, I'm interested in community solar, where do they go to find it?
Yeah,
Not well known.
Sure. So I think there are a couple of ways that you can do it. There are a couple of, like, Energy Sage is one example, but there are a number of entities out there that are resources that help you connect to potential community solar
Mhm.
programs. But I also encourage you, there are two specific community solar servicing companies. One is called Perch Energy, and that's a former Bluewave company that's now its independent owned company, and Arcadia. Those are two community solar servicing companies. So what that means is they work directly with companies that like Bluewave that develop a community solar project. They actually are the ones that find subscribers to the project. So if you go to Perch or you go to Arcadia, and the state's made it easier, they've kind of blurred the lines for the utility territories. So it used to be that within a particular area, within your load zone, you could only participate if there was a project in that general area. The universe is much bigger now, so there's more flexibility, so there are more options for people today.
Thank you. Anything else? Or I think it's. let's move.
Judy.
Oh, I'm sorry, Judy, go ahead. I didn't see-
So when I went looking for community solar options in Plymouth, they're very limited. So what are the ways of community can be encouraged to bring more community solar into and available to community members?
Yeah, so Judy, the first most important thing is you can subscribe to a community solar project, and it doesn't have to be in Plymouth. It can be within Eversource, and I think there's even an effort to even blur the lines between National Grid and Eversource, but within Eversource, you can participate. So it conceivably could be a project, you know, you name the community that is in Eversource that may be 30 miles from you or whatever the case may be. So that's one good thing.
I saw that, but there was also limited, just limited availability
Projects.
in general.
Yeah, well, and as I mentioned, there's a slowdown because of what I talked about previously with the incentives, right? Because the block structure has dropped. I think, we're down to block 8 or 9 or whatever the case may be. That incentive rate is no longer incentivizing projects to be built. The other thing that I will talk about, and Phil can certainly tell the same stories that I'm about to tell, but interconnection, actually connecting projects to the grid, has become increasingly harder to do. In large part because of utility requirements, costs that the utilities are imposing on projects that are trying to interconnect, delays from cluster studies where they're studying, a whole area and it's multiple projects that are being studied at the same time. So there has been progress made on that front. The legislature in the last session passed a bill that creates this new Grid Modernization Council to really drive utilities to do more modernization of the grid. And there was even more language in this climate bill. Maybe that's a good segue that would have made it even better and put more obligations on the utilities with more timelines and with teeth to, if they fail to meet that. But the other thing is, everything is driven by zoning in a community. And so, finding that right balance is what every community is trying to do. Some communities feel as though they've been overrun with large ground-mounted projects. Others have not. And so it's that balancing act, right? It's engaging with your planning board, your select board, and others to, encourage more solar development in the right places, and sending the right signals to do it.
Yes, well, the authorities are preaching solar, but they don't practice well. For example, I don't know if your company is involved in so-called brownfields solar, like our.
We did the first Superfund site project in Massachusetts, in New Bedford at Sullivan's Ledge. I think there were 8, 9, 10 different permitting authorities at the state, local, and federal level. So it was a tough project to do. And the state has incentivized that too. One big success story is the number of capped landfills across the Commonwealth that have actually been developed for solar. The state, back when I was there, we partnered with DEP because they're the ones who permit closures of landfills. And we were able to get, I think it was 40 or 50 landfills capped,
Wow.
municipally owned, capped landfills with solar on them. So brownfields, absolutely. And, you know, one thing that is a great opportunity is doing, you know, mixed use development and solar on brownfields, you know, reclaimed brownfields. And they're, you know, the state is incentivizing those. The SMART program incentivizes developing projects on brownfields. But they're just, I think part of the reason why you don't see a lot of them, Anatol, is because it takes a lot. There's a lot of permitting involved. You know, you got to get it right. And so sometimes that can be very costly. So the more
Yeah,
they
we're
can break
still-
down those barriers and enable even projects like canopies, parking canopies, which are very
Yeah.
expensive to develop. But in the smart straw proposal, they're talking about increasing the canopy incentive to a point where you'll see more of it. So
Yeah, we're still waiting for our landfill on the Beaver Dam
Animate-
Road.
Beaver Dam Road, yeah,
As you know.
all too well from my
Right,
page to
all
throw
too well.
days. My page to throw days in
Yeah.
Plymouth.
Yeah,
It-
so
Um,
I'd like to move on to the grid, the modernization, the permitting, and maybe the bills
Sure,
for the state.
Yep.
Since it's past 7:30, let's go on.
sure. I
Keep
can
going.
go quickly at least through
Yeah.
my points and go from there. So we'll start with citing and permitting because it's related directly to the climate bill. So the governor, when she ran for governor in her platform, she committed to creating a statewide conversation on citing and permitting in order to identify barriers to accelerating the deployment of clean energy in Massachusetts. She put together, she signed an executive order. The commission, there were, don't quote me on this because I'm going to get the number wrong, but just so you understand size, there were at least 20 commissioners on this commission. It was probably more than that. But it was a wide array of stakeholders, including solar development community, the offshore wind community, battery storage, standalone battery storage, environmental justice representatives, municipal representatives from the Mass Municipal Association, as well as the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which is like the old Colony Planning Council as an example. There were representatives from the utilities. There were representatives from the land use organizations. There were four representatives from the land use organizations, labor, business. So it was a really wide-ranging group of stakeholders that the governor said in September when she signed the executive order, you need to get this done in 6 months. I need a recommendation. I need a series of recommendations within 6 months. Well, by March of this year, we delivered those recommendations, which both the House and Senate, because Senator Barrett, the Senate chair, and Senator Roy, the House chair, served as ex officio members on this citing commission. So they were there in the room where it happened. So when we were able to come to consensus, and I'll send you the link so you can take a look at the report, because it is really a lot of good work went into it. Both Senator Barrett and Representative Roy were both there. So when the recommendations came out, both the House and the Senate included those citing recommendations in the Senate bill and the House bill. So that was not an area of disagreement at the end of the day. As a matter of fact, the House and the Senate, by and large, both agreed on the citing recommendations. Those citing recommendations did a couple of things. And I will tell you, even as a solar representative on the commission, you would think it would not be in our interest to advocate to keep things local. But we felt very strongly that cities and towns should still be responsible for citing and permitting locally in their communities. And so the end result was for any solar project that was 25, under 25 megawatts, which is all of them for the most part. Like most of the projects we develop and that are supported through the SMART program are 5 megawatt projects. We're not talking, you know, there aren't many that I'm aware of larger than 25 megawatt projects in the Commonwealth. So any project under 25 megawatts
Mhm.
would be required to still go through local siting and permitting. For battery storage, it's any battery storage project under 100 megawatt hours would still go through the municipality. The only difference is it now would require a consolidated permit. So when you go to permit a solar project now in a community, you've got to get your all your building permits, planning board typically, sometimes zoning board, your conservation commission, sometimes board of health. They all issue separate permits.
Right.
And so under the recommendations from the siting commission, each one of those entities would still be responsible for issuing a permit, but it would all get consolidated into a single permit, meaning that's what's appealable, not 5 or 6 different permits, because sometimes what happens is someone who's opposed to a project now can appeal 5 separate permits that'll go through 5 separate processes. And so to consolidate it, still retaining local control, each board still has to issue permits, but it's a single permit. And the other thing is that there's something called constructive approval that was also recommended, which means if the community fails to act within, I think it's 12 months was the recommendation, then the project is deemed approved. Most projects are permitted within 6 to 9 months. So 12 months is an additional 3, plus the municipality could appeal it. So if you have a constructive approval, the municipality could always still appeal it. Similarly, if it's denied, the project could appeal it. Under the siting reform structure, that appeal goes directly to the Energy Facility Siting Board. Right now, it could go to district court, it could go to land court, it could go to Superior Court. Under the Siting Reform Act or the siting reform recommendations, there would be a single direction of appeal to the EFSB. Some of the good news for municipalities is there was also a requirement for state standards. There would be state standards set so that all 351 cities and towns have consistent standards that need to be met, that the developer has to meet. There would be technical assistance provided to cities and towns for what they need, because many times they don't have experts on staff, they don't have the resources. So there would be resources provided in the form of technical assistance, and there would be assistance for municipalities or abutters who couldn't afford to appeal. There is a process for there to be funding for them to appeal if there's a hardship or there's a demonstrated need for financial support. So those are all really important things. And there would be a community engagement requirement that would also be included in all of this. So there was a lot of really good discussion. And, you know, at the end of the day, we were able to get consensus among all of these constituents who, up until this point, really hadn't all been given the opportunity to sit down together and talk through all of this. So that's what and anything greater than the 25 megawatts or the 100 megawatt hours would instead go to the Energy Facility Siting Board. That's where they would be permitted. That EFSB, as it's called, exists now. The threshold now, I think, is 100 megawatts in order for the EFSB to have jurisdiction. The municipality still participates in the process, but all permits are issued by the EFSB. And so in those instances, there would be things like community benefit agreements would be a requirement if you trigger that EFSB review. There would be public meeting requirements at the local level. There would also be, again, funding for those who need that in order to participate in the proceedings. And so that's all what was in the siting reform recommendations, and was what was eventually in the bills that both the Senate and the House passed. There would also be a new division created at the Department of Energy Resources specifically related to siting, which would be great because there really isn't that resource for cities and towns now. Unlike the Green Communities Division, which is a great resource for meeting your clean energy goals, there is not an entity, there's not a division within that agency that's expert on siting. And so they would create this siting division, which I think, that cities and towns could take advantage of. So that's what was in the siting recommendations. So at the end of the day, there were real differences between the House chair and the Senate chair on other components of the clean energy bill. It was not on the siting. It was not on siting. From what I've read in the reports, the Senate really wanted to proceed with some form of gas utility reform.
Yes.
Senator Barrett feels very strongly that we need to more rapidly move away from gas. And so he felt very strongly that language needed to be in there. The House felt that that was too big in too short a period of time, that there needed to be more conversation, more discussion about it. There was also disagreement on procurement of clean energy resources. I think the Senate proposed another division at DOER that would be on clean energy procurement, and that entity would manage the state, which would require the utilities to buy more clean energy, not necessarily even in Massachusetts, but within ISO New England. The House felt that the procurement should be run similar to, I think, how it was run with offshore wind, which is where the utilities drive the process, but with oversight from the state. So they just couldn't get there on those items, is what I understand. That's what the press report said. And so they ran out of time. And for those of you who don't know the process, I mean, I'm still trying to figure it out myself because it can get complicated. But in the second year of a 2-year legislative session, the formal session ends on July 31st. After that, they're in what's called informal. And the distinction there is when you're in formal session, no one member of the House or the Senate can hold a bill up. But when you're in informal, they can. So as soon as you go into informal session, any bill that's passed can be held up by any one member of the House or the Senate. So it makes it harder to legislate. So 31st hit, they're out of formal session. And so there were certain bills, economic development, climate, that did not pass. There were bills that did pass. Housing bond bill, gun safety, the HERO Act for veterans, the budget. So there were things that did pass, but there were critical pieces of legislation that did not. And so there's been some, I think, internal conversations between House and Senate leadership. There's definitely been a lot of press about the failure to pass those bills. So it is possible that either they do a special formal session, or depending on the bill topic, like economic development, for example, they might actually be able to pass that in informal session because there wouldn't be any objections if they can get it to a place where House and Senate leadership, majority and minority leadership are all on the same page. I don't think you'll see a climate bill in informal. Maybe you would see just the siting piece if they just pull the siting piece out, but I don't know.
I mean, is it worth, because a lot of groups are now writing to everybody. They're writing to Senator Barrett and to Representative Roy and to their state reps to, say, please, we need this done. Can, please get it done in the informal session. So we'll probably all be sending those letters anyway, but I wonder, well, you never know until until something happens, but it seems like the siting bill had at least more unanimity than the Senate bill involving the gas utilities.
Yeah, the siting provisions that were in both bills, both the House bill and the Senate bill, were almost identical.
Mhm.
And as I understand it, that's what they pre-conferenced that language,
Mhm.
which meant there's agreement between both parties, so they're
Yeah.
not gonna slug it out over that in conference. But these other items, the gas stuff was in the Senate bill and it wasn't in the House bill.
Right.
Their procurement proposals were different. So, I'm an optimist and would like to think that, there's still time. It's only August.
Right.
They don't leave session until the very end of the year. I was at a meeting last night with my area legislators, and their sense is that some of it will be taken up. We just don't know what yet because House and Senate
Right,
leadership have
yeah.
to make that determination.
Yeah. Mm.
So I know
Other-
I've talked way.
Other comments, questions? Phil, you have your hand up?
You're such a wealth of information, Mark.
Well, I'm
Try
gonna,
to keep it all
I'm gonna have
straight.
to fall asleep after this. My brain's tired.
So my question is, you may be positioned well to know the answer to this, or maybe not. Do you see any relief in sight for the 10K net metering cap?
So that was was that in the House bill?
Don't know.
Because I know there was net metering cap language at CBAN, which I'm on the board of, was advocating for flexibility on that front. If not in this session, like if they only do citing, the answer is no, because they'll just do citing.
Right.
If they do a comprehensive climate bill, maybe. But it will be, in my experience on the outside looking in, for the last 3 sessions, they've always done a major climate bill of some kind. So if not this session, then in the next 2-year session, and certainly, that's an interest of mine and a passion of mine. And if I find myself in a role where I can be an advocate for
Mhm.
clean energy and climate, I will be.
I mean, the 10K cap is much more relevant to residential with people switching to heat pumps
Yep.
and electric cars. In fact, our own, we had a 5.6K system installed 10 years ago.
Right.
And that covered all our needs until we started,
Hmm.
until we put in the heat pump and got the car charger and all that. And now it covers about half of our needs, and all of it would, we would be probably just slightly over 10K. And, we don't consider ourselves, we're not living large. We just have converted from gas to electricity.
And those are stated, and I appreciate the question, Phil, too, and Linda, your comment, because that is the stated goal of the Commonwealth, is to electrify everything. In other words, to move off of fossil fuels. How you get there is by sending signals and giving ratepayers and residents pathways to accomplish that. And if it's heat pumps, mini splits, it's EVs,
Right.
all of that, our load will increase.
Yeah.
And individual load will increase, but the benefit at the end of the day far outweighs, the alternative. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about all of that and what's the best way, how do we get there? And a recognition that there's still a lot of gas and it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not realistic to think that we can just completely convert from gas to electric, particularly when so many people are dependent on it for cooking and heating and everything else.
Right.
But a pathway that helps the consumer or the resident is really important.
Mark, as you know, I'm sure that there is a new special energy building code that requires wiring for all new construction for solar. Very few municipalities adapted to this special code, and I don't know how to persuade Plymouth to do that. To tell you the truth, Can you help us somehow?
Well, I mean, so there was a change in the building code for rooftop solar that made it more restrictive. It, in essence, is and you know it's fire code related, and so we have to be certainly very mindful of the concerns of public safety officials. I don't know if you're referring to that or you're referring to the stretch energy code, which is obviously that was a requirement under the Green Communities program for designated green communities. And I do know a couple of communities have pushed back to the extent that they've actually decided to no longer participate in the Green Communities program because
Really?
of the stretch code, because it's one or two communities. I think the town of Rochester is one where they decided at town meeting not to continue to participate in the Green Communities program because of the concern of costs to the homeowner or for projects, new construction projects. And so I think the department needs to make sure that they're engaging more with communities, that they provide more information and guidance. And then if communities make those decisions, they do, right? We're a home rule state, so cities and towns have that right. But you need to make sure they have all the information in order to make the right decisions.
But the new code is not required to for the green communities. So why would
I think it is. There's been a change, and there's this whole climate leaders initiative through green communities as well. But it was something to do with a change in code that I understand it in Rochester.
Right. I believe the stretch code has been updated and upgraded. And if you're
in Plymouth, you mean?
No, by the state, so that there's the updated stretch code, then there's some people call it the stretchier code, so it's even
Yes.
above that. So, but at a minimum, a green community has to abide by the stretch code, but the stretch code just got more rigorous based on these
Right.
changes.
Yep.
And now there's an additional stretch code that is even more rigorous, that's optional. You
That's right,
can stay a
optional.
green community without going to that highest level stretch code. But the goalposts for the lower level stretch code have also been moved out. So that might be why that one community decided that they didn't want to
Yeah.
continue it.
And they can. I mean, communities have that right.
Yeah.